So the reading today is about the widow of Nain, and it's a small reading. It's about 6 verses, but it's a powerful miracle. It's raising of the dead. So I think even though it's one of those 6 verses, very small reference in the Gospels, which it's only referenced in Luke, it's still pretty significant because not every day we see Jesus raising the dead. He actually does it 3 times in the Gospels. So the one of them is Jairus' daughter. The other one is the widow of Nain, her only son. And then the third one is the famous one that we usually know we do right before Lent, right after Lent, right before Holy Week, which is Lazarus. And so when we're looking at this miracle, we need to see, let's set the stage for Jesus, and let's set the stage for the widow, and let's set the stage of where they actually meet. And if you open up back to Luke 7, 1 through 10, you see this miracle that happens right before it is actually it's one of the more powerful miracles where Jesus is talking about the centurion and his belief. This story really quickly is the centurion, he goes and he comes and visits Jesus and says, "My servant." So he's asking about his servant. So you already see that this centurion has so much love that he's asking about his servant. Typically, a master, you care about your servant, but not to the point where you're going to visit who, in his mind, he knew the power of Jesus, because he tells him, you don't need to come to my house. Just say the word. So you could already see the power he sees in Jesus, and he's asking the all-powerful for his servant. And so Jesus marvels at what the request is from the centurion. And he said these, "I say to you, I have not found such great faith, not even in Israel." So right here we've seen one of the pillars of faith of a person, the centurion. And Jesus heals his servant by word. He doesn't go to him. He says, "And those who were sent returning to the house found the servant well who had been sick." That's the last verse of 7:10. So everyone, the crowds, and if you think about, let's go put ourselves back in the time with Jesus. This is the time all these crowds start gathering, and being, Middle Eastern culture, they're probably all gossiping and saying like, "Oh my God, do you believe what happened? This guy just said the word and he was healed." And it started going around, and then this crowd started building up. And that's how we enter into these 6 verses. So what you have to think about is Jesus is now walking to the gate of the city with a large or a great crowd. Whereas the widow, she's also walking with a large crowd. So we have 2 big crowds. Now, what I wanted to say about Jesus in terms of his word, what got me thinking is it really is all about who Jesus is as the second person of the Trinity, the Word of God, right? If we look back in Genesis, "Let there be lights in the firmament." He said it. God said, "Let there be lights," and it was. He said, "Let the waters abound," and it was. He said, "Let the earth bring back living creature," and it was. So that's the nature of God, the second person, the Word, Jesus Christ, that he speaks. And so it is. And we'll see that later in the verses. But if you look at a lot of the times when Jesus says words, he's very authoritative, a divine authority in his words. "Arise" to Lazarus, right? He says, "Arise, come forth." That is a powerful, like a directive. It's a very powerful statement. And so if we look at the great crowd that was following Jesus, they must have been on a spiritual high. This is the person that's, like a great prophet that's risen, as they said. So maybe not necessarily the Messiah, but this person's an amazing person. We need to follow him and see what he's more about. And in verse 11 it says, They went into the city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him with a large crowd. And then at the gate of the city, There was the widow, like we said, and her own crowd, and then they meet. So it's a conversion of two big crowds. One that is very, very, very sad. One that is very much on a spiritual high, we could say. Ecstatic that this might be the Messiah that's been promised for generations and generations. It's interesting to see how in those two groups of crowds, I don't think we have numbers, but I'm sure it's in the thousands, that in verse 13, it says, when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and spoke to her. He said, do not weep. Now, what do we know about this widow? She's obviously a widow, which means her husband had passed away. We don't know if it was recently, a long time ago, but we do know that she is a widow, that she has no husband that is alive. And then she lost not just her son, her only son. So these are all important pieces of what Luke was trying to convey. This woman was all alone at this point. After the funeral, she will be all alone. She's a widow with no children. She's in a very difficult place, in a very hard place. Yet, Jesus saw her and had compassion on her. In the group of thousands of people, Jesus saw her. And I think that's an amazing revelation in terms of what St. Luke is trying to tell us about the character of Jesus, that even in the thousands and thousands of people, he will see the helpless. He will see the hopeless. I think she was a hopeless person at that point. What is she going to do for food? I think women during that time didn't work. So how was she going to provide? Maybe charity? I'm sure aside from the grief of losing her loved ones, she had the grief of knowing what's the next day going to bring. And so when we think about it, let's put it into context. Imagine having a great celebration here on the Nativity Feast or Resurrection Feast, and some problems happen maybe in the parking lot. And maybe like Abuna going out and actually talking to them. That's like the concept of it, right? Is that the person leading the service, the person that everybody's eyes is with right now, steps away to kind of deal with this situation because he finds it so valuable. And this is the theme of the gospel, that Jesus is interested in the most needy. His focus is always on the sick, on the lost son, the lost sheep. That's why he said, wouldn't a shepherd leave the 99 to go get the one? That is the example. This story is the example of leaving the 99 to get to the one. And unfortunately, we often think the opposite way. That he wouldn't want to involve himself with me because I am that one. Because I am the one that is causing so much grief to him. I am the one that's a sinner. I am the one that's not worthy of him. But he said it in the gospel. I'm not looking for the 99. I'm looking for you, for the one. The lost one, the grieving one, the hopeless one. I'm looking for you, and I'm going to see you. I'm going to have compassion on you. And not just there, stop at the compassion. I'm actually going to act. And I'm going to do something unthinkable, unimaginable. Raise your son from the dead. And he approaches her and says, do not weep. I was reading it and I'm thinking, that might be a little harsh, do not weep. But again, I said it. Jesus speaks of divine authority in every conversation. And he's telling her, do not weep. I think it kind of reminded me, I have a little daughter and sometimes she gets hurt. Sometimes she's riding her bike, she falls off. And I assess the situation. I know her leg's okay, maybe she got scratched up. And my natural reaction is to tell her, don't cry, it's okay. In her mind, it's not okay. I just fell off my bike. I just hurt my knees. But I'm telling you, it's okay because I know I could bandage you up and you're going to be able to walk and ride the bike maybe in 5 minutes. And that's where he tells her, do not weep. not because he's not compassionate, because you see in the verse before, he had compassion on her, but rather he's telling her, don't weep because I'm going to take care of you. So the funeral literally came to a halt in verse 14. Then he came, touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. Why did they stand still? For a couple reasons. One, a stranger is touching the coffin. For them, they don't know who this is. But more importantly, a stranger is touching the coffin, and in Jewish laws, if you touch a dead person, you're unclean. And you have to go get purified before you can be reunited within the family, within the cult, the community, and within the actual synagogue. So it says in Numbers 19:11, when whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. And then you have to go through a purification process. If you don't do the purification process, you're cut off from the tribe of Israel, which is pretty intense. And so Christ coming in as a rabbi, as a leader, in front of all these people, so nobody would, he has witnesses that he actually is unclean at that point, touches the coffin, touches the dead person. And he does that exactly to show his power of life, that does not matter whether death is in front of me, I will raise the dead. I am not unclean. I am rather passing on purity, passing on life to the dead. The dead does not affect him, he affects the dead. And we see that when he overcomes the dead. But regardless, all these people don't understand this at this point. You have thousands of people perplexed at Jesus, who spoke the word and healed the centurion servant, yet now he's kind of in the back of your mind. And especially with a lot of our cultural things, when someone does something against it, you're like, in the back of your mind, you just can't help it. You're like, what is he doing? Why is he doing that? And that's the reaction. And so he was trying to show her, it doesn't matter. I am going to go above and beyond for you to heal your son, to bring him back to life, even if others look at me as unclean. Because I am greater than death, and I will overcome death. And he overcome death in front of him. And so no one's at that point questioning, other than the Pharisees and the Sadducees, why he's unclean or if he's unclean. They're focusing on the raised son at that point. The person that was dead that now is speaking. That's who they're focused on. And so we see this unwavering love time and time again in the Gospels. Time and time again, God shows his love for his people. And I'm going to quickly look at the steps that Jesus did, and maybe we can learn a little bit how to love like Jesus. The first thing is kind of obvious, but sometimes you have to say the obvious to fully understand it. And that's Jesus looked. Surprisingly, when I was looking into it, a lot of the miracles from Jesus, it said, Jesus saw, Jesus looked. So in Matthew 9:36, but when he saw the multitudes, he was moved for compassion. This was a general healing. And when he saw a great multitude, he was moved with compassion with them and healed their sick. That was right before the feeding of the 5,000. Then Jesus, looking at him, loved him and said, one thing you lack, go sell whatever you have and give to the poor. That was the rich young man. So he looked before he had the compassion or did the miracle. Therefore, when Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who came with her weeping, he groaned in the spirit. That happened right before he raised Lazarus. And then finally, when Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. John and Mary. These are a few examples. They're not all the examples, but you see a trend. Jesus saw. So the first thing we need to do is we need to look. You need to be on the lookout to see. Even though Jesus was in the big crowd of all his followers excited about his miracle, he still looked and saw her weeping. Looked and had compassion on her. There's a hymn that I really love is in the midst of the raging sea. And if you look at the verses, it even says it there. You may have not realized. It says, in the midst of the raging sea, which again is about our problems, our issues in our life. I was sailing. The waves were pounding me, making me afraid, and it seems that Christ has left me, because I no longer see him of my weak faith. Then what does it say? When Jesus saw me, he came to me quickly. When he saw me, he came to me quickly. So you need to look. You need to look out. You need to gaze. You need to focus. Because if you're not looking, you're looking somewhere else. Your focus is somewhere else. And that's the first thing that we need. The look is the focus. Even with anybody you love, you cannot have a conversation with them if you don't focus with looking with them. That's the first sign of love, is looking into their eyes, looking at them, and seeing and understanding them. But then we look. What's the second step? Compassion. And in the same verses, it had both. So he says, Jesus in Matthew 15:32, I have compassion on the multitude because they have continued with me for 3 days. Let's give them food, which is again the miracle. So he saw them and had compassion. And when Jesus saw a great multitude, he was moved with compassion and healed their sick. But when he saw the multitudes, he was moved with compassion, because they were weary and scattered like a sheep having no shepherd, in Matthew 9:36. He saw, and then he was moved with compassion. It went hand in hand. And that kind of goes with us. We see, and then the next step is being moved with compassion. Why? Why are we moved with compassion? I think John 15:9 says it perfectly. As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. We use that same principle. Because God loved me, I have the ability to love. You're moved with compassion because you have love in your heart. Jesus is love. And so he naturally can only be moved with compassion because he loves. He loved and paid the ultimate price, and he gave us that love. And so because of that love, we also are moved with compassion. And that's the key. Christ loves us. God loves us. He made us in his image. He came, he was crucified for us, saved us, and so we can't help but overflow with love. If you truly, truly love because you were loved. Now, those two steps are pretty straightforward. You look, you see, you have compassion. The last one's usually the hard one. I think a lot of us, including myself, can do number 1 and 2 pretty easily. Third one's action. It was always followed with action. Jesus was moved to action because he sensed her pain, her despair, her loneliness, and her utter hopelessness. He was moved with compassion for his love, but then he acted. He healed, he raised her son and brought him back to life. He was moved with compassion with Mary and Martha and raised Lazarus. He was moved with compassion and fed the 5,000 and made the miracle. It never stops at compassion. Jesus never says, you know what, I'm really, really sorry you're going through this. God never says, man, you are going through some difficult times. Okay, thank you. It doesn't stop there. It's always action. The next step is action. And so action's critical, and action for us is critical. Action's moving. Maybe we're not able to raise the dead, but we can give what we have in many aspects. It's not just money, time, prayer. Prayer is action, and I think that one is really, we leave it really at the bottom, but prayer is action. Instead of just responding sometimes to people, hey, I'm having a hard time, I'll pray for you. Do you actually take that step and go pray? Do you continue to pray for them? Prayer is action. So when we're talking about action, it's not just, you see someone maybe in a difficult position and you help them physically. That could be praying for them. That could be figuring out how to support them in a different way. There's many types of action, but the key is to act. So when we're looking at this story, there's three, obviously there's a lot of people, but three main people we talked about: Jesus, the widow, and the only son. And the question today is, where do you see yourself in this story? Do you see yourself in Jesus' shoes, being able to see, look out for people, have compassion about them, and act? Or maybe this isn't the time for you to think about that part, but rather you're the widow. Maybe you're the only son, dead in the coffin. So when we're looking at the widow, she was emotionally, physically, she was just run down. And I think that could be us as well. Emotionally and physically run down. Look, I can't look at others because my problems are in front of me right now. I can't help others because the problems are too much for me. Everybody has forsaken me. Everybody has left me. But just as this story may be about the widow, it's also about the son who was dead. Again, death for us means living a life of sin. The son was already dead. He was already past his time. And maybe that could be us, where we think we're in a coffin, going through the gates, ready to be buried. No hope. At least the widow, she had some hope. He had no hope. He was already dead. And maybe that's how we feel sometimes. Or maybe you feel like all three, because life has very different seasons. Sometimes we're on a spiritual high. Sometimes we're feeling the love of Christ. Sometimes we can't see him. And so we may be all three. And that's okay. Because at the end, we had one common denominator. And that was Christ not only helped the widow, he helped the son. He gave him a continuation, a rebirth, a renewal of his life. And to be able to come back, he must have not been the same person. He was dead for whatever reason he may have died. He came back. He must have lived a life abundant. Why? Because he met Christ. The widow must have lived a life abundant. Why? Because she met Christ. When you meet Christ, you don't come out the same. You may be on your way to a funeral, death, anguish, heartache, and you walk out renewed life. Who would have thought that out of a funeral? And so the interesting piece that I read by the church fathers, they contemplated on the three people that I mentioned very at the beginning that Christ raised from the dead. Jairus' daughter, she had recently died. The widow of Nain's son, he died about a day, they were guessing, because of the funeral. And Lazarus, he was dead for multiple days. His body had a stench. So what I'm saying is, it doesn't matter if sin overtook us. It's been a little bit, it's been a day, it's been a little period of time, or we've been living a life of sin for a very long time that we feel that the stench is on us. The church father said Christ was able to heal and resurrect each one. Doesn't matter. And that's how we have to live. Doesn't matter if I'm dead out a few hours, a few days, a lifetime. There's still hope. What we must remember is that Jesus sees us. He has compassion on us because he loves us. And through his ultimate action through the cross, he saved us. And glory be to God forever. Amen.